Step right up. Welcome to the world of the strange, the unusual, the fantastic. Leave the commonplace behind and take a voyage to the unreal. You're about to witness human beings with talents that are so incredibly bizarre you may not believe your eyes.
We have always been intrigued by the grotesque, deviations from ourselves. Perhaps it's an attempt to answer the question, who am I? What is my nature? At carnivals and amusement parks, we can see ourselves and others from different perspectives. Our imagination is engaged as we see mirrors and distortions of ourselves. Long ago, there lived a genius and prolific writer, Jonathan Swift, who wrote a tale of distorted creatures and distorted perspectives. In it, he also asked the question for all of us, who am I? What is my nature?
First raised yesterday afternoon when the 70-foot giant was found shipwrecked on Dublin's Dollymount Strand. He's clad in a typical period costume, appears to be unconscious and totally unaware of the fuss his sudden appearance has caused.
Giant experts who have already examined the floating stranger say he bears a striking resemblance to Jonathan Swift's Gulliver, which first landed in Lilliput in the 18th century.
In the story of Gulliver's travels, this beached sailor takes 4 voyages to visit creatures large and small in places far away. It is a dark and comical tale read on many levels.
Do you know what his name is?
No.
Do you know what his name is? What?
Gulliver.
Gulliver! Where did he come from?
The water left me from heaven.
Quick! He's coming! And he's huge!
Published in 1726, Gulliver's Travels remains a satiric giant in our literary history. From parades in Ireland to a pub in New York's Lower East Side, it taps into something in all of us.
A farm dog gets saddled to the highway.
I've been drawn to Swift over the past 25 years for many reasons, I suppose. I think what sustained me the most is how unanswerable he is. He's a very mysterious writer. There are few solid answers in Swift. In fact, he appears to like to set up puzzles to lead us on.
A restless wit, a skeptic, a man of many contradictions. Jonathan Swift was the greatest satirist in the English language. His purpose, he wrote, was to vex the world, not to divert it. Swift was born in 1667 and wrote well into the next century. This was the Age of Reason, a time of great exploration when Europeans were traveling to distant lands and bringing back astonishing information about the larger world. There were inward journeys as well, as men grappled with the question of the essence of human nature. Are we basically benevolent or selfish creatures? Sociable beings or beasts of prey? Swift, ever distrustful, profoundly questioned the belief that man is a purely rational animal. He did not accept the classical notion that man can rise above his nature and live a life of pure reason. With Gulliver's Travels, Swift takes the reader on 4 bizarre journeys, pointed satires on the imperfections, the follies and vices of man. Throughout the voyages, Swift radically plays with our sense of perspective, forcing us to re-examine our own nature. In Book 1, a giant Gulliver visits the land of the Lilliputians. In Book 2, he is dwarfed by the Brobdingnagians. In Book 3, in Laputa, he visits with scientists who abuse science and reason. And in Book 4, Gulliver must face the question of just who he is. Is he a Wynnum, a four-footed noble creature of reason, or a Yahoo, a monster creature of will and impulse?
There's been an enormously rich response to Gulliver throughout the years.
It was a blockbuster. I mean, it went through multiple editions really quickly. Everybody read it.
It's been read as a children's tale, as a traveler's tale, as a dialogue of a madman, as a great satire.
It's, shall we say, deceptively simple, but it's very profound.
I think he was a master of saying things that could mean many things and leaving you to decide what you made of them.
Swift was an inveterate fairgoer. In general, he liked the life of the streets. There were at least 3 major fairs in London at this time. When Swift would have seen the fairs, there were 4 major exhibits that were there. There were midgets, giants, a variety of trained animals, a large number of horses, clever mares they were called, and then degenerate human beings. In Swift's time, there was the wild and hairy Irishman. What really interests me about these fairs is that when you go back over those exhibits and the sideshows, the dwarfs, the giants, the very intelligent animals, and the degenerate human beings, you have, in fact, the basic structure of Gulliver's Travels. One of the things that I think Swift is doing is using the monsters to bring up questions of what it is to be a human being, and then further than that, of how little we know about our nature and what its lower limits may be.
Monster. A giant.
In Book 1, a shipwrecked Gulliver finds himself in the land of the Lilliputians. Dainty people, 1/12 his size.
Deagle! Don't do that!
Over time, he finds them to be less than civil. In fact, they are vile and pernicious.
Hold your tack! Hold, hold, hold!
What do we do with this monster? Shoot it where it lies.
Gulliver's Travels is a satire of the English and their politics of the day.
Destroy it. Dance upon a rope. A tightrope?
Gulliver learns that to receive favors and obtain political office, the Lilliputians must leap and twist about on a rope.
Well, I've heard it said that politics demands such skill.
Let it be known that each candidate shall proceed from hither to yon, and anon from yon to hither, practicing such tricks as he shall deem proper. Should any part of him...
In Book 1 in Lilliput, where you have the court satirizing the court of England at the time, you have a particular kind of political situation which is based on nepotism, favoritism, flattery, corruption, and then you see how that corruption filters down and defines the way in which all of the members of the society behave toward one another. They become petty, they become small-minded, going along with their size.
Now that you've been elected, suppose you consider the cost. We've placed you high on a pedestal which will sometimes feel like a cross. Like Jesus and Gandhi and Martin, heard our applause and acclaim. With satire or with a pedestal, so much better for us to take aim. So much better for us to take aim.
Satire is an ancient art form which is still with us today.
I'm very privileged to do what I like to do, which is to make caricatures. But I do feel part of a tradition of, I know where and why we're doing it, And I'm quite proud that we took it from print to television. A really good caricature tells you pretty much what you already know, but it's great to see it there, if it's not based on some kind of truth, it doesn't work. You think that most public figures probably have a very highly paid PR working on their behalf to improve their image. We're only really counteracting the balance a bit, This is Elvis, the young Elvis Presley. Oh, this is Lisa Marie, look. That's as close as you're ever going to see them together. And they'll eventually get put through the mangles. Very pleasurable, putting politicians through mangles.
Squeeze every last drop out of him. There, as soon as he's been dried out. I'll hang him up to dry.
I guess we all try to be Swiftians. We all try to carry on the tradition. The large Gulliver-type creature being tied down by ant-like people. It's a cartooning device we use for denoting a large creature being held helpless and hostage by a bunch of smaller creatures, which seems to happen in this world. The bigger the United States gets, the more it seems to be rendered that way. I look forward to doing, using this device more and more.
The thing about Swift was he wasn't some malcontent in a garret or a singing folk songs in San Francisco or Moscow. He was a cleric. I mean, he played the church organ, I guess. He was a doctor of divinity at the cathedral in Dublin, and he had this wickedness about him, which was wonderful.
He railed against everything. There's hardly a thing that Swift didn't rail against.
He wrote to Alexander Pope, "Principally, I hate and detest that animal called man, although I heartily love John, Peter, Thomas, and so forth."
The things that Swift most hated, the things he found most inhuman, are war, slavery, colonialism. Ireland was a colony, and Swift became increasingly more given to the Irish cause and exposing the brutality of the British rule.
Swift saw Ireland as a beautiful country, ruled and exploited by the English. He writes, "My heart is too heavy to continue this irony longer, for it is manifest that whatever stranger took such a journey would be apt to think himself traveling in Lapland, rather than in a country so favored by nature as ours, both in fruitfulness of soil and temperature of climate. The miserable dress and diet and dwelling of the people, the general desolation in most parts of the kingdom, the families of farmers who pay great rents, living in filth and nastiness upon buttermilk and potatoes."
Jonathan Swift's a very ambiguous figure. There he is, striding the countryside. He was a great traveller around Ireland on horseback or on foot. And then at the same time, I often have difficulty too thinking of him down in the cathedral, thundering, as I anticipate he would have done from the pulpit, though there's not all that many records of his sermons. This is a very complicated figure, a very multifaceted figure. And what has gone to form him, of course, was very complex. Born here, of English immigrants, spending a lot of his life in England in the political court of Queen Anne, then comes back here to a deanery that he doesn't really think is up to what he should have, and yet he makes of it a major political pulpit and becomes revered in the very Dublin that he actually has very mixed feelings about. He's not all that happy about Ireland and the papists and the poverty and the small-mindedness of the place.
Surely he would have regarded his stay in Ireland as a kind of banishment.
Exactly.
That he
Or
was
exile.
sent, yeah, exactly. That he was sent, he was given this deanery in St. Patrick's because he had failed to get a bishopric in England. and because it was a kind of demotion for him. So everything he says, everything he satirically says, is aimed at the people in the mainland. So all of the cracks are at the parties in England, and his defense of the Irish, it is his way of getting back at his enemies in England.
As time went on, of course, he began to relate more and more to the Irish people. He really was the first Irish patriot. He felt that the Irish people should not be ashamed of themselves. By the laws of God and of nature, he said, you are not inferior to any people. So stand up for yourself and stand on your own dignity.
By the end of the 17th century, new technology had greatly improved the printing process. Books and pamphlets had become more readily available, and Swift took advantage of their new power and influence.
There was an outpouring of propaganda tracts from all different positions, and of course some of the poets of high culture saw this as a real disaster, people like Pope and Dryden. But Swift did not resist this. In fact, Swift relished this. This was his real genius, to understand how this modern print culture was going to reshape culture in a much more democratic, popular way. Now we see Swift enshrined in anthologies, and he looks like, you know, the great writer, but he really began as a spin doctor and a controversialist and a tabloid writer almost, I would say. Swift, throughout his life, was a writer of tracts and propaganda.
His most famous pamphlet was A Modest Proposal, which satirized what he saw as the haughty attitude of the English to Irish poverty and hunger.
There's a very well-spoken, easy-spoken, easy-mannered narrator calmly suggesting that the children of Ireland should become a new meat form for dishes for restaurants.
Swift wrote, I have been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young, healthy child, well nourished, is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled. And I make no doubt that it will equally serve in a fricassee or a ragout.
It's the calmness of it, and also the graphic imagery, because he actually points to certain cuts of meat that are possible from a tender child, how they might be cooked, and so on. So it's a combination of graphic imagery, looked up at very, very closely, and a calm, dispassionate, seemingly indifferent manner. It's a combination of factors that produces quite a stunning effect.
When Swift made his modest proposal about feeding the Irish babies to the English and thereby solving the poverty problem, there's a couple of ways of looking at that. He was showing the greed and the insensitivity of the British upper class, but might not he also been disapproving of the Irish having so many children? See.
In Book 2 of Gulliver's Travels, Swift exaggerated the flaws of the flesh to show a gross and brutish aspect of humanity. Gulliver again is cast ashore, this time in the land of the giant Brobdingnagians, and is picked up by a farmer.
He blew my hairs aside to take a better view of my face. He then placed me softly on the ground upon all four, but I got immediately up and walked slowly backwards and forwards to let those people see that I had no intent to run away.
In the first two books, the shifts in perspective, the defamiliarizing technique that's going on. I mean, at first, Gulliver is this huge giant in the middle of a land of dwarfs and pygmies. Then immediately, book 2 switches over to Gulliver as the dwarf himself in the land of giants. Everything is relative. We can't talk about things like size or any other kind of quality without talking about how it's relative to other things.
By changing perspective, Swift encourages us to see the world from a different angle, to understand what it feels like to be small and helpless before the forces of the world. Gulliver is thoroughly examined. He is treated like a child and is even assigned a nurse.
I was placed upon a table in the largest room of the inn, which might be near 300 feet square. My little nurse stood on a low stool close to the table to take care of me and direct what I should do. The Queen became so fond of my company that she could not dine without me. I had a table placed upon the same at which Her Majesty ate, just at her left bow, and a chair to sit on.
But the world gradually becomes more ominous for little Gulliver.
2 rats ran smelling backwards and forwards on the bed, whereupon I rose in a fright and drew out my hanger to defend myself. The child seized me by the middle and got my head in his mouth. The dwarf took me up in both hands and, squeezing my legs together, wedged them into the marrow bone above my waist. The monkey was seen by hundreds in the court, holding me like a baby in one of his forepaws and feeding me with the other. I was almost choked with the filthy stuff. Then I fell to vomiting, which gave me great relief.
Swift insists on telling us things we don't want to know. I mean, whenever we see a film, we know that people have to go to the lavatory in the outdoors, but we don't particularly want to know about that. Swift insists on telling us. He says, the reader will no doubt be wondering how I managed to vacate my bladder and bowels or whatever.
The reader doesn't care.
The reader would sooner not know.
The reader does care.
He said, I proceeded as follows.
I hid myself between 2 leaves of sorrel and there discharged the necessities of nature. I hope the gentle reader will excuse me for dwelling on these and the like particulars.
I think Swift didn't like people too much, you know. I mean, he was pretty repulsed by anything physical, you know, orifices, sex, armpits. He's always writing about that kind of thing. And on the show, we've done quite a lot of that nonsense, you know. It's very cruel, but it does, I mean, unfortunately make you laugh, you know. This is Fergie. Looks to me like she's in here for a refit. So they'll get into the head, mend the eyes, and then replace Fergie's head.
There isn't too much sex in Gulliver's Travels except where Gulliver is taken into the dressing room of the maids of honor.
The maids of honor would often strip me naked from top to toe and lay me at full length in their bosoms, wherewith I was much disgusted because, to say the truth, a very offensive smell came from their skins. Their skins appeared so coarse and uneven, so variously colored, when I saw them near with a mole here and there, and broad as a trencher, and hairs hanging from it thicker than pack-threads, to say nothing further concerning the rest of their persons.
One other interesting aspect of Swift, which of course runs right through Gulliver's Travels, and that is this loathing for flaw and the physicality of humanity and its pretensions and its certain repugnant quality about the way it physically expresses itself, right down to issues of size, but also, of course, of excrement and just the very smell and sound and taste of humanity. Quite where that comes from is not clear.
Anyone who reads Gulliver's Travels, even as far as Book 2, will become conscious of many monstrous depictions of the human body. Because Gulliver, being small, is able to see the giants up close, and he becomes aware of how imperfect the human body is when seen in that way. And I think this is very, very, very much part of Swift's attitude to the body and ultimately to sexuality, and perhaps also to women.
What do we do with those Brobdingnagian breasts? In some ways, the attempt to come to terms with the body is one of the great themes of Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver is one who, in some ways, doesn't like that body, doesn't like that human shape, wants to find a way to get beyond it, to get above it.
What makes Swift a very 20th century figure is that he was blunt. He said what he thought. And therefore he doesn't leave too much for the analyst to burrow away at, because he says, I think sexuality is close to excremental function, and it is, and he was preoccupied with dirt and failure and flaw and greed and various kinds of rather nasty human impulses.
For a fastidious person like Swift, 18th century Dublin would have been difficult everywhere, Horses fouled the streets, sewers were elementary, and people may have bathed only once a month. If you had an obsessive-compulsive personality like Swift, contact with your fellow man could be, well, uneasy and tense.
One wonders, did he shrink from the closest physical intimacy because of an obsessional preoccupation with contamination and with dirt, which of course is in Gulliver's Travels as well. I think there's no doubt that Swift had problems about intimacy. He could get close, but seemingly not close enough.
He had enormous difficulty with women. He always approached them in a tutorial way. And if you look back, Swift was born posthumously. In other words, his father was dead when he was born. So he had no father. He was dependent on the kindness of relatives. Within a short time, his nurse kidnapped him and took him to England. And when his mother discovered this, she wrote to the nurse and she said, don't bring him back because he's far too small to face a journey back to Ireland. Keep him. And so he was kept in England for 3 years. So he was without his mother and without his sister.
Now, people have, and they don't have to be Freudians, have speculated on the extent to which Swift's dislike of women, or his complex attitudes to women, because he didn't dislike them, he loved them as well. It was a very love-hate relationship, whether this stems back to his very early deprivation.
The only thing he has is desertion, in fact, by women. And I think this had a very, very deep effect on him.
Swift never married, but he did have relationships with 2 women, whom he nicknamed Stella and Vanessa. Dubliners wondered about the nature of these friendships. Platonic, romantic, sexual, it remains a mystery to this day. Stella was raised on an estate in England called Moor Park. Swift was also living there while he worked as secretary to Sir William Temple, a prominent member of Parliament. And while he was at Moor Park, he tutored Stella, who was 8 years old at the time. Years later, Stella and her housekeeper moved to Ireland. She saw Swift regularly, and scholars continue to speculate about the relationship. Were they secretly married? Was she his sister, his daughter? The pair spent many hours together at Marsh Library on the grounds of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. For 40 years, Stella was the bright, particular star of Swift's life.
There is a story told about Swift and his great friend, Dr. Delaney. Dr. Delaney was coming into the library, that's Marsh's library, and Swift rushed past him, obviously in a very distressed state. And Delaney moved then into the library and met Archbishop King, who was another great friend of Swift's. And Delaney said, what on earth is the matter with Swift? Archbishop King was crying, apparently, at this stage, and King said to Delaney, you have just seen the unhappiest man in the world, and upon this, you must never ask me a question. That is the story that... Now, from that, the speculation is that Swift told Archbishop King why he could not get married. It's like as if Stella was his sister, and he constantly, all the time, anytime he refers to her, he speaks about friendship, my friendship. He doesn't say love, and he constantly, through it all, always says friendship. And it's exactly the same thing with Vanessa.
Vanessa, the other woman in his life, lived at Selbridge, her family's estate outside of Dublin. It was here that Swift also visited her, quite regularly, and they would meet in a secluded bower she'd had built especially for him. She even planted a shrub to mark each visit. He would talk to her then about his work on Gulliver's Travels. But Vanessa wanted more. As her attachment to him grew stronger, his visits seemed too infrequent. She left no doubt about her feelings for Swift. I was born, she wrote at one stage, with violent passions which terminate all in one, that inexpressible passion I have for you. For his part, while assuring her of his continuing devotion, Swift admonished her against any ideas of marriage. He encouraged her to find other diversions. Remember, he says, read and exercise for the improvement of your mind and health of your body, and grow less romantic, and talk and act like a man of this world. It is said that one spring, Vanessa heard rumors that Swift had married Stella. Frantic, she wrote to Stella asking if it were true. Stella told Swift about the letter, and he, in a furious temper, confronted Vanessa. He could not forgive her for breaking the rules of discretion he had imposed on her. That was to be their last meeting. Already suffering from tuberculosis, she died a few weeks later at the age of 35. He did not attend her funeral.
Women are crucial throughout the life of Swift. His nanny, his mother, his relationship then with Stella, and then, of course, Vanessa.
Gulliver's Travels was published in a time of growing scientific inquiry. Anything seemed possible, even if it wasn't. And a woman named Mary Toft produced a hoax that would hook all of London. Even the best minds at the time were willing to suspend disbelief.
About the same month that Gulliver's Travels was published, a young woman in Goodliman, Surrey, which is a small village about 30 miles southwest of London, claimed that she gave birth to rabbits. The story, rather surprising to us, I think, gained some credence, and all of London was to visit her where she was, surrounding her bed, waiting for her to give birth to her 18th rabbit. It turned out to be a hoax, but as a matter of fact, two of Swift's closest friends, Dr. Arbuthnot, who was a doctor, mind you, and Alexander Pope, the poet, both gave some credence to Mary Toft.
Her story, no matter how incredible, would not be rejected out of hand. It was the 18th century, the age of reason, an age of scientific investigation and examination. Optics opened up new worlds. Newtonian physics came into vogue. Voyages were taken to distant lands to collect exotica, plants, animals, and people. Scientific inquiry, however, could be carried to an extreme. In Book 3, Swift explodes our sentimental views of reason, science, and technology. He didn't trust the growing optimistic view of the power of reason.
He didn't believe in progress, I think, which is
I
important.
think, yeah.
He didn't believe that people were wiser than their ancestors. He didn't believe that technology could make people wiser or happier.
Swift never believed that. And I think, John, he was, that was one of the reasons he was suspicious of modern science.
Quite clearly,
as was coming out, as emerging at that time.
Because along with that went a whole, this is the beginning of the Enlightenment, if you like. If you want to trace the Enlightenment back, it begins with the confidence in the possibility of progress in modern science.
In Book 3, Gulliver finds himself on the flying island of Laputa.
The reader can hardly conceive my astonishment to behold an island in the air, inhabited by men who were able to raise or sink or put it into progressive motion as they pleased.
It is a land of science gone amok.
Well, why?
Excuse me, Majesty.
It was abstraction that Swift was against. He associated abstraction with science. And I think part of the reason was he's basically a skeptical person. He didn't think that scientific theories could ever be grounded in reality, or in the end could even be proven.
Ah, you've arrived at last. Here, put some of these in there.
In Book 3, many of the experiments which appear so silly to us are actually experiments that he's taken out of the official publication of the Royal Society.
Excuse me, what is it you're doing? I'm extracting sunlight from cucumbers. Just another 8 years, and I'll have the problem solved.
Swift's idea was that reason must always keep in touch with the ordinary practicalities of life. It found its raison d'etre when it was in the service of man to improve mankind. He'd no use for abstract reason, abstract philosophies, or anything like that.
In Laputa, each experiment becomes more abstract and absurd than the last. Gulliver is introduced to a physician attempting to cure a dog's colic with a pair of bellows.
This he conveyed 8 inches up the anus, and drawing in the wind, he affirmed he could make the guts as lank as a dried bladder. The animal was ready to burst, and made so violent a discharge it was very offensive to me and my companion. The dog died on the spot, and we left the doctor endeavoring to recover him by the same operation.
It's less that Swift is against science, I think, than that he makes, as he often does about things, a distinction between the uses of science and the abuses of science.
He first took my altitude by a quadrant, and then with a rule and compasses described the dimensions and outlines of my whole body. And in 6 days brought my clothes very ill-made by happening to mistake a figure in the calculation.
Gulliver's final visit in Book 3 is to the Struldbrugs, people who live forever, but continue to age.
At first, Gulliver is ecstatic. He says, oh, you know, if only I could be the immortal, if only I could be immortal as they, I would do this and that, and etc.
More and more people have alluded to the Struldbrugs because they see this happening in our own society where technology can keep us alive but cannot retain our youthfulness.
What Swift sees are not wonderful, noble, immortal creatures, but essentially senile beings who have to endure. It's the worst sort of torture. We are all creatures who are going to die, and Swift has used the body to symbolize his pessimism.
It's true in that if you look at the traditions of the kind of things that Swift was writing about, it's still going on. In many ways, caricatures are fairly negative craft. You're just pointing out the same things generation after generation.
Well, I've been doing this for 40-something years, and I find it comes round about every 10 years that I'm doing, I think I'm doing the same cartoon again. People are doing the same thing over and over. There's a Swiftian metamorphosis there, from the normal to the terrible and ghastly, and then back to terribly normal again. Scary, isn't it?
In Book 4 of Gulliver's Travels, our hero arrives at the land of the Houyhnhnms. Swift, through Gulliver, draws the reader in to ponder the question, what is our nature? What is normal? What is abnormal? Gulliver meets the Houyhnhnms and the Yahoos, two very different kinds of creatures. He finds the Houyhnhnms to be the most extraordinary creatures that he has ever met. Everything is resolved by the exercise of reason, simple reason, and Gulliver considers them his masters. The Yahoos, on the other hand,
The yahoos were the most filthy, noisome, and deformed animal which nature ever produced. Upon the whole, I never beheld in all of my travels so disagreeable an animal, or one against which I naturally received so strong an antipathy. There was nothing that rendered the yahoos more odious than their undistinguishing appetite to devour everything that came in their way. It happened that a young female yahoo, standing behind a bank, inflamed by desire, came running with all speed and leaped into the water within yards of the place where I bathed. I was never in my life so terribly frighted. When the Winhams brought the beast and I close together, and our countenances diligently compared, they thereupon repeated several times the word, Yahoo. And when I happened to behold my reflection of my own form in a lake or fountain, I turned away my face in horror and detestation of myself, and could better endure the sight of a common Yahoo than my own person. My master told me, in some perplexity, that in the last General Assembly, when the affair of the Yahoos was entered upon, the representatives had taken offense at his keeping a Yahoo, meaning myself and his family, more like a Winham than a brute animal. When all was ready and the day came for my departure, I took leave of my master and lady, my heart quite sunk with grief. As I was going to prostrate myself to kiss his hoof, he did me the honor to raise it gently to my mouth. I paid my respects to the rest of the Winhams in his honor's company. Then, getting into my canoe, I pushed off from shore. During the first year, I could not endure my wife or children in my presence. The very smell of them was intolerable. My horses understand me tolerably well. I converse with them at least 4 hours every day. They live in great amity with me and friendship to each other.
The most relevant thing for me is in book 4, where Gulliver sees the Yahoos and says, "Oh my God, these are the most disgusting, the vilest creatures on the face of the earth." And completely, they're abominable, and he curses them out and rushes away from them. And then within 3 pages, he looks into the face of the Yahoo and sees himself, and sees this, a perfect human shape. The question that poses is, what does it mean to look in the mirror and see reflecting back at us what we most fear and revile and what we least want to acknowledge a kinship with? And that's a very heavy question and a disturbing question, because really whatever it is we're throwing out at others is really a part of ourselves.
What Swift is saying is there lurks this monster in us all which has to be kept under control. I think Swift was getting at the depths to which human nature could sink in absolute depravity. He didn't believe, I think, that human nature was totally depraved, but he felt that it could become totally depraved. It could sink to great depths of depravity. It could do the most dreadful, cruel, terrible things. And of course, that has been shown to be so in the history of the world.
Okay, children, and we come.
In a small town in Northern Ireland, school children from both sides of Ireland's conflict, Protestant and Catholic, together visit a museum, the land of Lilliput.
Hello! Sorry, I forgot how loud my voice is to little people. So, you'd like to hear of my adventures in Lilliput?
Here they are introduced to Gulliver, and in particular to Swift's anti-war message. They are shown how essentially meaningless conflict between two societies can be.
About a fortnight later, the Emperor's principal secretary, Reldressel, came to my house and said,
Man Mountain, you promised that you would help Lilliput in its war with Blefuscu.
"And what is the reason for this war?"
Because when the Blefuscans eat an egg, they break it open at the big end, while we break it open at the small end, which of course tastes far better.
Well, of course. People fight wars for the stupidest of reasons.
Look, everyone.
Swift had that very, very great dislike repugnancy towards violence and cruelty of any sort. He always maintained that civilized people should be able to get over their point of view to others by persuasion and not to be resorting to violence. And of course that's a great lesson for today.
The horrors were relevant and they were clear to him. They were not covered up and concealed under a covering of gentility and grace and elegance. They were raw and they were there. And we come 250 years later in a century of Hiroshima and Bosnia and Rwanda and indeed, dare I say it, Northern Ireland. It's raw again. You'd have to be, in the old sense, in the philosopher's sense, a lunatic to miss the flaws at the heart of humanity. Swift saw them absolutely spot on.
Lunacy, whether collective or individual, had always fascinated Jonathan Swift. In fact, the notion of madness was of interest to many 18th century thinkers, philosophers, and politicians. As urban populations grew, cities all across Europe, Dublin included, were beginning to encounter the phenomenon of large numbers of mentally ill in close settings. The private madhouse emerged as these communities turned their attention to the need to cope with the problem. Though that care, by today's standards, was far from perfect.
And Swift, of course, came back to Ireland and he said, I found a proper hospital where these poor, unfortunate wretches will be treated with dignity. And so he did, St. Patrick's Hospital.
Jonathan Swift left his entire estate to found a hospital for what was then called fools and mad. It wasn't a quixotic gesture or a sudden impulse. He'd been thinking about and planning just such a legacy, had discussed it with prominent people in the Dublin community, for example, and indeed laid down very clearly how this new hospital was to be governed.
And it's alive and flourishing today, thanks to Swift. Swift was very, very much ahead of his time at that time, because mental illness was often regarded as being the result of demon possession. And Swift pioneered this treatment of mental illness, which is wonderful.
As Swift wrote with some irony in his epitaph, he gave the little wealth he had to build a house for fools and mad, and showed by one satiric touch, no nation wanted it so much. There has been a long debate whether Swift himself went mad. It may depend on your definition of insanity. The pseudo-scientific phrenologists of the 19th century exhumed his skull, looking for clues to his eccentric genius. We do know that throughout his life, Swift was tormented by Meniere's disease, which produced vertigo, dizziness, and a ringing in his ear. In a figurative sense, he may have been driven mad by it. In the last 3 or 4 years of his life, he appears to have had a slowly developing senility, during which he withdrew and became more and more out of touch. Eventually, the great satirist became a ward of the court. William Thackeray described Swift in later life as an immense genius in awful downfall and ruin. So great a man he seems to me, that thinking of him is like thinking of an empire falling.
When he died in 1745, there was great mourning in the city. The city mourned the loss of the Dean of St. Patrick's because they felt as a patriot what he had done was, if not secure any great degree of liberty for the country, at least, like David, he had stood up against a kind of Goliath. He had given people back some sense of identity and pride.
He had a passionate commitment to the person, very 20th century. The individual was important to Swift. He despised and suspected ideologies. It was very cynical and skeptical about human pretension, grandiosity.
Swift perhaps is a kind of schizophrenic. There's the clergyman who believes, who has deep faith, and there's the writer who's deeply skeptical, deeply pessimistic, very gloomy. But they're never separate, they always work together. And I think that's the way he sees human nature, as a compound of some wonderful, but mostly very disturbing forces.
Gulliver's Travels? Well, Gulliver's Travels in the end is a great lament concerning human foibles and pretensions. Scientific, artistic, political, personal. And in that sense, 250 years later, we're no further on. I mean, I don't know what Swift would make of the 20th century. He would recoil in horror, I think, at its aberrations, but he would not be surprised. He would not at all be surprised.
Long ago, there lived a genius and prolific writer, a man named Jonathan Swift, and he asked the question for all of us: who am I? What is my nature?